It's a question that has been on my mind for a long time. How did King Henry VIII remember his brother Arthur? He had to, could, and was finally allowed to lead a life that was not intended for him, but for his older brother Arthur. For Henry, his whole life was shaped by being number 2 behind Arthur. He was the second son of Henry Tudor and his wife Elizabeth of York. He was the second Prince of Wales, appointed by his father, Henry VII. He was his father's second heir to the throne. He was the second husband of Catherine of Aragon. It was always Arthur whom he followed, even when he was long dead. Henry's plans were all cancelled when he had to replace Arthur after the latter's death in April 1502. The Tudors were very thorough at this. We know them through rumours. Henry may have been intended for an ecclesiastical career. Perhaps he should become Archbishop of Canterbury. But not even the controlling Margaret Beaufort bothered to make detailed notes about Henry. For all we know, this was good. Henry grew up relatively free and carefree with his sisters at Eltham Palace. His mother took care of his upbringing. Henry was already ascribed a certain charisma as a child. As a teenager, he became passionate about the opportunities it offered him to be part of the royal family. In Arthur, on the other hand, the burden that would lie on his shoulders when he was king was drilled from day one. Due to his death, Henry's world collapsed from one day to the next. His parents panicked, fearing for the continued existence of their dynasty. This fear drove Elizabeth of York into another pregnancy that would mean her death. Henry VII became a bitter, depressed man who now tried to drill all the lessons of kingship in Henry in record time, which had taken him more than a decade with Arthur. As a result, Henry almost became a kind of royal hostage. He was only allowed to leave the palace to play sports. A Spanish report from 1508 speaks of a complete submission to his father and grandmother. Henry never opens his mouth. The extent to which he was allowed to practice dangerous sports is also disputed among historians. David Starkey, for example, does not believe that Henry was allowed to participate in the actual duels during jousting. The new heir to the throne had to accompany his father at all times, but behave with restraint and be visibly anxious to learn from every experience. The charismatic child developed into a depressed young man. This does not excuse his later crimes, quite the opposite. The catastrophe that was the formative years of his life with his father could have made him a good person. At first, this seemed to have been the case. It is therefore very interesting to explore the question of how Henry felt about his brother, whom he had to replace. He could not pull from many personal experiences. Henry and Arthur were only born together for about 10 years. Most of the years, Henry was old enough to understand the concept of an older brother. Arthur was in Wales. They only saw each other in person on a handful of occasions. For example, Henry led Catherine of Aragon down the aisle at Arthur's wedding. She probably knew him better than Henry. Arthur Tudor is often described today as the forgotten prince, in order to set him apart from his father, the miracle king, and from Henry VIII, the tyrant. For Henry, the forgotten prince was probably right in a very direct way. He could hardly have had a vivid memory of the man that Arthur was. In the later years of his life, this proved to be quite advantageous, as the memory of his brother could be adapted. In the context of the great matter, his name was finally omnipresent again. And it was not so much about Arthur himself, but about his widow. But that's what we'll talk about at the end of this video, because this case impressively shows how Henry's perception of his brother changed over time. Research has largely overlooked Arthur's personal significance in Henry's life, focusing instead on broader themes. While there are some approaches that address this topic, they remain sparse. A more prevalent line of inquiry examines the impact of Arthur's death on Henry's behavior as king. For instance, Henry's relentless pursuit of a male heir is often linked to his brother's death. As it fell to Henry, to ensure the continuation of the Tudor dynasty. According to the customs of the time, this duty was not considered fully accomplished until Henry fathered a legitimate son. Beyond this, research on Arthur primarily concentrates on the end of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. However, the discourse typically revolves around a single question that remains as compelling today as it was then. Did Arthur and Catherine consummate their marriage? For Henry, though, the memory of his brother was secondary to his pressing desire to escape his own marriage to Katherine. When scholars do address the memory of Arthur, they often focus on two aspects: his funeral, which Henry did not attend, and the design of his grave. On these matters, it was Arthur's parents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, who played the decisive roles. There are narratives surrounding Arthur's funeral procession that Henry may have heard. For example, a ford in the River Severn is still associated with the journey of Arthur's body from Ludlow to Worcester. Additionally, certain inscriptions from Arthur's time were left untouched. In the Church of St. Peter in Ivor, for instance, one inscription commemorates Ralph Aubrey, late Chief Clerk of the Kitchen, to Prince Arthur. This inscription, created during Arthur's lifetime, was neither removed nor apparently intended to be. Such enduring markers may have subtly contributed to Henry's understanding of his brother's legacy. Dr. Sean Cunningham's blog post has been the most insightful source regarding Henry's personal memories of Arthur. According to Cunningham, Henry retained several mementos of his brother, including Arthur's portrait, some of his clothing, and his books. This suggests a significant interest in Arthur's life. Cunningham also posits that Henry's legendary fear of contagious diseases might be rooted in Arthur's early death. Cunningham argues that Henry likely thought less of Arthur as an individual and more in terms of princely virtue when reflecting on him. Henry's memories of Arthur were likely limited and idealized. However, Arthur was forcibly brought back into Henry's thoughts during the disputes surrounding his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. For instance, the second half of the originally agreed dowry had still not been paid. Although the marriage contract was established on June 23, 1503, final negotiations were only resolved in the spring of 1509. Progress had been delayed by the death of Catherine's mother, Isabella of Castile, which complicated diplomatic relations. Documents from the period of Henry's divorce from Catherine reveal an intriguing detail. Henry seems to reference Arthur simply as Arthur in several instances. I say seems because I have only reviewed printed versions of these documents. To confirm this definitively, the original manuscripts would need to be examined. It's possible that an editor transcribed Arthur in place of Prince Arthur. However, if this phrasing is accurate, as I believe it is, given its recurrence, it suggests a certain familiarity and personal connection Henry felt toward his late brother. Interestingly, Catherine also referred to Arthur in a similar manner. One speculative but intriguing aspect of Henry's memories involves love letters. Arthur reportedly sent Catherine a series of letters before she traveled to England. Similarly, Henry is well known for his love letters, particularly those written to Anne Boleyn. It is possible that Henry's use of such letters was inspired by his brother's example. Giles Dews is another figure worth mentioning. He was originally hired by Henry VII to teach Arthur French, a task he evidently performed well. 35 years later, Henry VIII employed Dews as a French tutor for his daughter Mary. It is conceivable that Dews also served as Henry's French teacher. Historian A.F. Pollard suggests that Henry and Arthur may have shared additional tutors, including Bernard André. Lastly, an interesting detail comes from a letter written in 1536 by Sir John Melton to Thomas Cromwell. In this letter, Melton mentions his attendance at Arthur and Catherine's wedding. This fact seems to have carried a certain significance, though the precise reasons remain open to interpretation. Let us return to Cunningham's insights. He suggests that Catherine's stories may have influenced, at least in part, the image Henry formed of his brother. This hypothesis finds some support in the historical record. For example, in the 3 years following Henry and Catherine's wedding, former members of Arthur and Catherine's household were granted various rewards. Additionally, a box containing a deed of Arthur was discovered. Henry also confirmed grants previously issued by Arthur. Furthermore, several former members of Arthur and Catherine's household appear on the pardon roll for 1509 and 1510. It seems quite plausible that the new queen played a role in these decisions, subtly shaping Henry's view of his late brother. Now, let's shift from personal memories to official commemorations. Under Henry VIII, Arthur remained an integral part of the royal family's memoria, just as he had been during their father's reign. This is exemplified by a confirmation of grant issued by the Hospital of the Savoy. The chaplains of the house were instructed to pray for Henry, Katherine, and the souls of Henry's parents, and Arthur's. It is worth noting that Henry had other siblings, including 2 sisters who were still alive at the time. During Henry's divorce proceedings with Katherine, the phrase "Prince Arthur of noble memory" became a standard reference. This phrasing was undoubtedly intended to elevate Arthur's legacy, making Henry's argument that his marriage to Katherine was unlawful appear more compelling. When Catherine of Aragon's funeral was being planned, her prior marriage to Arthur was cited as justification for granting her a very solemn and honourable funeral according to historical records. However, the reality of the funeral itself differed significantly from this description, which we will set aside for now. In this context, Arthur's reputation was further elevated. He was commemorated as the noble and excellent Prince Arthur, brother to our sovereign lord, King Henry VIII. Remarkably, there is not a single source that portrays Arthur in a negative light. On one hand, this was clearly in line with the Tudor policy of statecraft. On the other hand, it also reflects Henry's personal view. His brother was worthy of an honourable and enduring memory. Undoubtedly, part of Henry's motivation lay in exploiting the memory of his brother for propaganda purposes during the divorce proceedings. Since Arthur was regarded as honourable, it would be challenging to dispute the testimony that the prince himself had confirmed consummating his marriage with Katherine. The Habsburgs, to some extent, fell into Henry's trap. They attempted to cast doubt on Arthur's character. Katherine claimed that she and Arthur had only shared a bed 5, 6, or 7 times. Additionally, a Spanish messenger informed the Pope that Arthur had been impotent and therefore incapable of consummating the marriage. However, this assertion damaged the Habsburgs' credibility in the eyes of the English public. Notably, Katherine refrained from repeating this claim herself, evidently recognizing that it would not serve her case. This is not a discussion of the great matter. That topic will be covered in a separate video. For now, the key takeaway regarding Arthur's memory is that it became a weapon in the conflict. Henry sought to bind his now unwelcome wife to his brother's legacy, using it as a means to justify separating from her. Henry's memory of Arthur may also provide insights into another question. When did Henry begin to doubt his marriage to Katherine? The birth of his illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, in 1519 is often cited as the turning point. Indeed, in the years that followed, sources begin to reveal a shift. Henry no longer routinely confirmed all of Arthur's measures or renewed his grants. This may be coincidental, but overall it seems that in Henry VIII's perception, Arthur became closely associated with his first wife, Catherine. How Henry managed issues relating to his brother's legacy appeared to reflect his evolving feelings about his marriage. This connection deepened during the divorce proceedings. In this context, Henry was compelled to portray Arthur in an exceptionally positive light. After all, Henry's goal was effectively to return Catherine to his deceased brother, a striking notion given that he and Catherine had been married for 24 years, while Arthur and Catherine had shared only 6 months. This raises the question of whether Henry ever truly regarded Catherine as his wife. Before their marriage, the Spanish ambassador reported, citing a Privy Council member, that the union seemed unlikely because Henry's conscience was heavily burdened by the idea of marrying his brother's widow. This brings us back to the central theme. Henry lived much of his life in the shadow of someone else's path until he decided to break free. Examining how Henry remembered Arthur reveals the story of his struggle to escape that shadow. Ultimately, Henry sought not to be remembered as Arthur's replacement, but as a distinct figure in his own right. In that sense, he succeeded. But in Henry's case, this success came with devastating consequences. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to help my channel grow.